Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back. I had a fun time doing panel discussions last year with a lot of interesting people, and I've got two of the greatest experts on what's going on at the Dallas Opera with me tonight. You probably mostly know them, but I'm supposed to introduce them anyhow. So, General Director and CEO Keith Cerny.
Thank you.
And also Dr. Stephen Dubberly, who does many things. Associate Professor in the Division of Conducting and Ensembles at UNT, Music Director of UNT Opera, teaches courses in opera repertoire, and he's all around town. Anywhere there's opera, Stephen Dubberly's there, I'm pretty sure. Well, good to see you two. I want to start with Keith Cerny and really talk about the programming of this work, because it's a big decision to put on Aida. It is, as I understand it, the epitome of grand opera. Tell us about the process of bringing this to the Winspear stage.
Certainly. Well, Aida is possibly the grandest of all grand operas, and one of the questions that we always get asked is, are you doing it with or without elephants? Just to get that out there, we will not be providing elephants on stage this fall on the Winspear, I'm sure to the great relief of the ATPAC team. The way we approach programming is to look very much as a blend of the classics that are very well known, that drive single ticket buyers, and then the more modern or off the beaten track works. I've actually just passed my second year anniversary with the company, and
congratulations.
Thank you. Aida was programmed quite a bit before I got here, but it really is a perfect opening night opera. It's well known, it has famous arias, and it will get the season off to a great start. And then we will, of course, present Turandot later in the season, and then the Aspirin Papers for its 25th anniversary.
October 26th is the first performance at 7:30 p.m. What kind of preparation in terms of years does it take to put on Aida? Is this when was it first discussed that this was going to return? Do you know?
Well, just to cast a production like Aida with singers who can really do it justice and beyond, it's a minimum of a 3-year lead time, and ideally a 5-year lead time. Right now, Jonathan Pell and I are working on we've actually completed our programming choices up through June of 2017 and are already casting principal roles. And it's done on a rolling basis, so we will start by looking at who we want to be the principal artists up to 5 years out. That way people aren't too booked up. We don't cast every role, because as we're looking at the smaller roles, we can cast those perhaps 2 to 3 years out. So again, I've only been here 2 years, but I would imagine Jonathan was casting this 3, if not 4 years ago.
Fantastic. I want to get into the cast because they're fascinating, and some of their stories were alluded to earlier on, but certainly already known as some of the lead interpreters of those roles around the world. Well, Stephen Dubberly, I brought you on board because you seem to be able to fill in the background in a lot of these works when I've talked to you in the past. Give us an idea of the origin of this opera as you know it. I understand it was a very unusual commission for Verdi when he was approached.
It was, Verdi was at an interesting time in his life in the late 1860s. He was incredibly rich. He had made a fortune. He had worked incredibly hard and written all those great operas, and really was not motivated for several reasons to keep writing operas. He retired to a farm. He had been a peasant boy from a small town, and he went back to that town and bought a huge estate, and I think it really pleased him to be able to rub it in the faces of the villagers who he thought had spurned him when he was young. And he made a big deal out of being a gentleman farmer. He had devoted a great deal of his life, even as a composer, to the idea of Italian unification, independence and unification. He had achieved that. He'd even served as a senator for a while. And he was just at the point in his life where he wasn't that motivated to keep working. And one of the great factors in all of this is the fact that he was really discouraged for 2 reasons. One, that he just couldn't find a libretto. In other words, the words for an opera that he liked. And we can talk about this more, but I think there's a looming shadow of Wagner always when you talk about late and middle Verdi, because he felt a strong sense that time had passed him by, that even though he had seemed radical in his day, he now was more conservative. And so he was very discouraged by all of that. And it took a lot. without getting too much into the history of Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt at the time was really just sort of a vassal state in the Ottoman Empire. But Ismail Pasha, the man who took over in 1863, wanted Egypt to be recognized as a European country. He said, I have taken Egypt out of Africa and placed it squarely on the continent of Europe. And he loved Verdi's music. So he offered him these extravagant sums of money, for example, to write a hymn for the opening of the Suez Canal. Verdi declined. And finally, he just got a couple of agents, the Pasha did, and just begged Verdi and said, you can name your fee. And they found a story about Egypt that Verdi really liked. And they said, if you'll write this opera, you can name your fee, we'll do whatever you want. Verdi was also very discouraged because he had gotten so rich and famous that one of the only places that could afford to do his operas was Paris, the Paris Opera. But he hated working in Paris because he hated the stylistic constraints, the idea that you had to write a 5-act opera, the idea that you had to have a ballet.
You always had to write those big ballets in the middle of them.
That's exactly right. And what's hard for us to realize now is that he was more and more leaning toward the aesthetic ideals of Wagner, and he was trying to find ways for his operas to be more real. It's interesting because we talk about Aida being the ultimate grand opera, but when you read the correspondence, he was trying really hard for it not to be that. And it's an interesting confluence of events that while there was on this one side the push toward spectacle and huge chorus and elephants and that sort of thing on the part of the Egyptians, from his standpoint, he wanted to write an opera that went back to the simplicity of real characters and real difficult situations. And Aida is known in many ways, not only, as Keith said, as the ultimate grand opera, but as also, once you peel away the veneer and take away the elephants, it's also an incredibly intimate opera about some really interesting relationships. And so it's interesting that it's both, and that's what makes it so great, I think.
Well, my understanding about this commission was, you said he was he was offered extravagant sums, and 150,000 francs is the number that I've heard. I don't know what that is in today's money, but I gather it was pretty close to the most that had ever been offered for an opera.
Well, what I've read is that in the money of 1870, which is when this came about, it was the equivalent of, in 1870, $20,000.
Okay.
Which would be today, and I don't know these figures, but that would be an astronomical sum to pay someone to compose an opera.
Plus, Verdi asked for the rights to all performances, the proceeds of all performances after that. So he's driving an incredibly hard bargain. And Keith Cerny, as somebody who's worked with operas, opera composers to commission this, would you have taken that? I guess the ruler of Egypt had a little more to offer.
The Khedive had considerably bigger resources than the Dallas Opera, probably. But
although he ended up, going bankrupt and getting deposed.
So I do think this is an opera where there is an opera to be written just about the commissioning process. Yeah. What I also find striking about the work is it's so famous. And for people who come to it the first time, it can feel like an outlandish grand opera plot, when in fact, at least the basic scenario for the work was written by one of the most distinguished Egyptologists of his day, Auguste Mariette, who also designed the sets and costumes. So it was intended to be a serious work, and although hieroglyphics had only been relatively recently deciphered by Champollion, at least with a nod to what would have been real history of the old kingdom of Egypt. It's interesting now that in the popular consciousness, I don't think if you polled your average opera goer, you would say, well, this was really intended to be historically accurate by the standards of his time, or at least inspired by history, but in fact it was. And I think that also lends a lot of character to the piece as well.
But I've actually heard some people say that he was trying to write what we would call verismo opera, later on, within this thing. I think of somebody like James Cameron trying to put the Titanic story together with all this authenticity, and maybe not on that scale, but perhaps. But the question becomes: do we need all these big stages when it really is a relationship opera, isn't it?
Well, it's a combination of both, of course, and I'm so excited for the Dallas Opera production because I think this company has a track record of finding that balance, making the music and the drama incredibly real, great theater in its own right, and yet at the same time providing spectacle and, of course, having this wonderful opera house. So I'm really excited about it. I'll be there on October 26th, and hopefully several other performances as well.
All right. Let's get to the cast a little bit. I found this newspaper article. I want to read a little bit about it here, if you don't mind. And some people may know this story already. Top tenor Roberto Alagna has stunned opera goers at La Scala in Milan by storming off stage in the middle of a performance after he was booed. The Franco-Italian singer who was playing a lead role in Verdi's Aida walked off minutes into the second night of the opera house's new season, basically after Celeste Aida, I guess. His understudy rushed on, wearing jeans, and carried on Sunday's performance. Who are we talking about?
Well, if I were in artist management rather than general director of an opera company, one of my bits of advice for my clients would be, when you make your debut at La Scala, bring your thick skin, because they do boo, and that's just the way it is. Some extraordinarily famous names over the decades and decades have been booed there. So,
my understanding is the fellow in jeans was Antonello Palumbi, right? Who is your Radames in this performance, and he's gone on to really have a reputation in this. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yes, and he also appeared as Canio in I Pagliacci in 2005. So he's been here once before.
One of the most acclaimed Dallas Opera performances in recent history, I know too. The opera starts a few minutes into it with one of the most famous and also most challenging tenor arias, and I think this proves that the first 5 minutes of this opera can make or break the whole production. Tell us about what a singer faces, a tenor, coming into to the first moments of Aida.
Well, it's interesting because Verdi, up to this point, had certainly written challenging tenor roles, but there's something about Radames in terms of it really is in many ways a role that requires almost a Wagnerian tenor voice, stentorian. And yet he has to sing so delicately and so beautifully. Very often when tenors are booed for their Celeste Aida is because, as happens many times, instead of singing that last high B flat pianissimo, they bellow it out because that's all they can do at the time. And you need to be a little forgiving and understanding. That's incredibly difficult to do after you've sung this incredibly difficult aria. But again, what I find about Celeste Aida, the tenor aria that pretty much opens the opera, is that it's incredibly delicate and yet requires great force. And that combination is so rare. I did see the Pagliacci, and I was very impressed with Antonello for that very reason, that it requires a big voice, the Canio who sings Vesti la giubba, but he also has to have great delicacy. And this is so important. I was also so impressed, if any of you all were at the Dallas Opera Lohengrin a few years ago with Christopher Ventris, and that combination of hearing a huge tenor voice singing softly and delicately, there's really nothing like it. And as Keith is saying, there are very few people in the world who can take that on.
Go ahead. And they, as Stephen has said, they have to start that way. And for all of the people in the room who've been to a number of operas over the years, you will have seen that quite frequently singers hold back a little bit at the beginning of the opera and then lift it towards the end. As they get towards the end of a run, they tend to take more risks. But particularly in that first performance or two, and maybe the dress rehearsal was 2 nights before, they'll hold back a little bit. I think a lot of it is subconscious, but you do see it. This is an example of where that's a terrible strategy, because the tenor has to come out, and I think you've captured it very well. It's a big famous aria, but the orchestration is very delicate, and they have to sing like it's the middle to the end of the opera, and they've been on stage for an hour and a half already, and are really feeling good about the audience and how they're working with them. And in fact, they have to do it all within the first handful of minutes. So it is a killer. But I'm sure Verdi, at this point of his career, knew that. This is not something he would have stumbled into. So I think it is all his plan for the opera.
Verdi, of course, was a master of writing for the voice, And the fact is, he demanded the right, and certainly had earned it at that point in his life, to have complete control, complete approval of the casting. And he still, in 1870, when he was writing Aida, still insisted on not writing a note until he knew exactly who the singers were and had heard them, so that he could write specifically for them.
Well, so I've heard some singers say that the tessitura, I guess the middle range of what's sung in Aida, isn't here. It's here. He apparently had a pretty amazing cast to start with.
Yes, and just for those of you who want to be reminded, this term tessitura, is different from range, because in many ways Radames does not sing very high in the sense of singing at the highest range of a tenor role. But Kurt is absolutely right. The tessitura is where it tends to lie the most, and it tends to lie in a very uncomfortable place for tenors, and particularly for a big-voiced tenor. So it was a very special tenor that he wrote this for, and it's incredibly difficult.
Let's go on to Latonya More. I remember listening to the Aida on Metropolitan Opera, driving around town and hearing this familiar name who had replaced Violetta Ormana at that Met production. And this has been a really big deal. Give us an idea on the background of Latonya More.
Sure. Well, she's an artist that the Dallas Opera feels a very strong rapport with. She actually won the 1998 Dallas Opera Guild vocal competition. Then she was Maria Callas' debut Artist of the Year in 2004, and has really never looked back. Her career continues to grow. And again, this is long before I got here, but she's someone that has kept very closely in touch with Jonathan Pell, and by good fortune, he happened to be in New York for that performance. He was going to hear various other singers and got to hear her, and was just absolutely ecstatic how well she was singing. We're feeling, of course, ecstatic too, so we're looking for the opening. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, of course, I cannot fail to mention that she was a student at the University of North Texas when she won the Dallas Opera Guild competition, and she was leaving just as I was coming in. I came to UNT in 1999, but of course heard many stories about her there in Denton. But what amazes me most is, over the 13 years as I have come to know people associated with the Dallas Opera, the incredible care and nurture and kindness which not only Jonathan Pell, but which so many people, some in this room, lavished on her. This was a girl who in many ways came from humble origins and had an amazing personality, an amazing voice, but was a little rough around the edges. And I think that, and there are many other wonderful singers who got their start with Dallas Opera, but I think she's a perfect example of someone who benefited greatly from a great deal of not only resources but of love lavished on her by the people of Dallas and by Dallas Opera in particular. So it's a wonderful story to see her come full circle, and as you're saying, how delightful that Jonathan happened to be there when she filled in. It made him so very proud, and we all should be proud about that.
Absolutely amazing. This is a love triangle, and my understanding is it's a little bit unique in the equality of these roles in terms of what they demand of the singers, and that perhaps Verdi hadn't written specifically for mezzos as much as before, as he did in this opera.
Well, there were obviously some great mezzo roles before that. The previous opera that Verdi had composed before Aida was Don Carlos, to give you the French title, Don Carlo, as it was known in Italian translation. And it's a similar story in the sense that Amneris, like Eboli in Don Carlo, is an aristocratic woman, in this sense, the princess, the daughter of the pharaoh, who is driven insanely jealous by the fact that the man she loves doesn't love her, and who destroys his life because of that. And at she is very tormented and tortured. You have to say she's a villainous when you see the incredibly hateful way that she treats and addresses Aida, but at the same time she is racked by guilt. Verdi was interested more and more in those mezzo roles, there's no question, and wrote for bigger and bigger mezzo voices. But he was also interested, I think when you look at Aida, you can't say this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. These are really complex relationships, and he manages in Aida to make you feel great sympathy for each of these characters, including Amneris, as well as horror, for what they do, because Amneris really has an opportunity to once she realizes that Radames and Aida love each other, she has an opportunity to let them go, and she cannot, because she is so very jealous.
Nadia Kresteva, is that correct? Is your Amneris?
Absolutely, making her debut here, and I saw her a while back at the Met. She was also, actually in this role, she was also spectacular. I think it's important to point out part of the convention of the day, too, would be that this more conflicted role had to be the mezzo. Students of opera know that the rarely gets the girl,
the nice guy,
and the soprano, well, with some exceptions, is often presented as the more appealing personality, and this very much fits with that convention. But to go back to your original question, yes, all three roles are substantial and very important, and there's a lot of dramatic intensity in how all these different characters interact.
And that's, I suppose, why it's so difficult to cast. Do you get an idea? I mean, you obviously can't say who or how many generations do you go through when you're trying to book singers when Jonathan? How many people does it take to ask to bring the right people into a role like this?
Well, as I've started to work with Jonathan on casting, what we do is start first of all with the programming, the repertoire that we want to present out in the future. And then what we typically do is talk about, for the principal roles, a couple names that we might be interested in bringing and seeing if they're available. Because the Winspear is such a wonderful opera house, because the Dallas Opera artistically is doing very well in terms of our reputation, I would say it's pretty rare we get turned down because someone just doesn't think they want to come to Dallas. There's probably a handful of artists who are just so busy that they're going to say, well, no, I'm going to focus my career in New York or New York plus Europe. But there's lots of artists who are excited about coming here. The real issue is time horizon. And we were working a few weeks ago, Jonathan and I, on casting decisions for a production we want to do in the fall of 2016. And we were able to secure all three roles that we wanted pretty quickly. But if we had tried to do that for the fall of 2014, forget it. Right. So.
And now, but it's also becoming very clear you need pretty good understudies as well, right?
What we do, and the whole question of understudies or covers is an interesting one. I worked at San Francisco Opera between 2004 and 2007 as the chief operating officer and chief financial officer for both initially Pamela Rosenberg and then David Gockley. And it was interesting to see their different philosophy on how much risk they were willing to take on covers. Covers are expensive. If you bring in an artist that can sing a major role and you pay them to be part of the process and be available at the drop of the hat like was required in La Scala, understandably those people expect to be paid. At the other extreme, if you don't cover obscure roles, you can get in a situation where there's only a handful of people alive who really know the part, and then what do you do? And I remember vividly at San Francisco when we were doing Ligeti's Le Grand Macabre, the conductor did a great job with opening night, and poor guy had a disc explode in his back. He got through the evening, this was a Friday night, and we had another performance the following Wednesday. So we had to find someone in this wide world who could conduct world-class production of Le Grand Macabre on 24 hours notice. And this is before Alan Gilbert had done it with the New York Phil. I mean, probably if he had done it, we would have called him. So we were able to find someone out of Germany, and everything looked like it was all set till we found out that he didn't have a passport. So Pamela Rosenberg, who of course lived many years in Germany and knew many, many senior government people, we actually had to get not only a state senator in California involved in the visa process, but the Prime Minister of Germany, literally to get this visa done in time and the passport created in time, and we did it. So that was an experience that I think aged all of us quite a few years in 5 days. And I think his plane was late getting there too. I mean, it was just one of those things. But for covers, one thing that's very happy about living where we do in North Texas, we've got a terrific airport. We're not that far from New York, and not that we would ever want to be in the situation of having to bring someone in for a big role on short notice. It is, we're at least traveling distance from New York, and that really helps. And then Jonathan and I, yes, we do strategically cover, but it's too expensive to cover like opera houses used to, where essentially you had most major roles with somebody in reserve.
This production, I don't know how much you want to give away as far as what staging the approach might be and that kind of thing, but you've been putting some wonderful blog posts up lately, and one of them really pertained to a lot to Aida, I think, and I'm going to quote you here. As I see it, time and the flow of history, opera, because of its unique creative process, usually sits at the intersection of 3 and sometimes 4 distinct time periods. It too draws on many layers of history, some real, some imagined, to generate its artistic impact. Apply that to Aida, if you don't mind.
Sure. Aida, as we've talked about, written 1871, and for its day was intended to be good history, a scenario based on something that actually happened as near as people could determine it at that time. An archaeologist looking at this at 2012 would look back and say, but they didn't know so much 130 years ago, and that would have been true. But for its time, it was intended, at least as to be grounded on history. So when Verdi was writing this piece, he was looking back thousands of years into Egyptian history, and obviously inspired by that. I think when we look at this today, we are very struck as a society by how much the world has changed and how much our view of the Middle East has changed. In the mid to late 19th century, there was still quite a romanticized view of the Middle East, and one of my favorite artists is David Roberts, the Scottish painter and lithographer and watercolorist who went to Egypt. And when he came back, and I've been to Egypt several times, of course in my life a couple times, Egypt is bathed in this kind of Mediterranean light that does not exist in Egypt. And that's just a little example of this, the mindset towards Egypt at the time the opera was being written. The world, I think, is a much more complicated place and a more nuanced place in terms of how we look at that society when we sit and watch this as an audience today. So those are the 3 time periods that we will be exploring. It is a co-production with the San Diego Opera, sets by Michael Jurgen, and in the best meaning of the word is intended as a conventional production of the opera. We're not updating it to a different time period or putting it in classical Greece or something. And when I wrote that article that Kurt is referring to, the point I was making is that sometimes directors take these 3 different time periods and actually then overlay a 4th, which is moving a particular work to a different time.
Yes. We do see it through our own eyes, in our own time, and there's a couple of things that can't be ignored for Americans and our society, and one is that there is a slavery component and a component of race, and Aida is from Ethiopia. Would Verdi have seen those issues the same way, or are we putting a layer of that on ourselves? And he was always interested in captivity in his operas, correct?
That's right. I think Verdi was very attuned to the cultural and political issues of his time. He was always looking for a good story, and this story happened to have its origins in Egypt. I find it interesting, for example, that the Khedive, the Pasha in Egypt, wanted a story about ancient Egypt first of all, you have to realize that in the 1870s, where Egypt is, of course, an entirely Muslim nation, as it really is today. Not entirely, but mostly, and it was part of the Ottoman Empire. But it's so interesting that this Muslim leader wanted to do a production about glorifying its ancient past. If you contrast that, for example, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, who were wanting to blow up relics of an ancient pre-Muslim past, but he really wanted to bring out that part of it. And then if you look at it carefully, you understand that this story, which the Khedive himself had approved, does not put the Egyptians in the best light. And so it's very complex in that sense. It does make some strong statements about slavery, make some strong statements about people being different, about the hatred between nations, and then how that is juxtaposed with this love for each other of an Egyptian and an Ethiopian, and the conflict they have with loyalty to their own country. And if you look at Verdi's operas, there was always an element of that. If you look at his operas about the Crusades, which he wrote in the 1840s, if you look at his operas, more domestic, so shall we say, about that are not so political as about the relationships, like Traviata or Rigoletto. But then when you look at so much conflict in his operas, he's very much attuned to these issues and handles it in a very, very even-handed way. He looks for the theatrical effect and doesn't choose the easy way out, which is very often to be jingoistic. There's nothing rah-rah Egypt or rah-rah Ethiopia, and it's interesting because this is happening, the creation of this piece is happening right at the time of the Franco-Prussian War. And it's very interesting to read about Italians and their reactions to what was happening. Basically, the French went crazy and declared war on Prussia, their neighbor to the north and east, which was much more powerful, and they got crushed. The French got creamed. And the Italians were in many ways culturally sympathetic to the French, and were horrified by the things that then happened in France as a result of this war. But it's interesting reading Verdi, reading Ghislansoni, reading all these Italians who were involved in the creation of Aida in the year 1870, expressing horror at the war, the senseless and idiotic war, basically, that took place between France and what became Germany.
He was a very patriotic man for Italy. Am I correct about that? And this has dueling patriotisms in it between Ethiopia and Egypt, I suppose. And the other thing that occurs to me is that he, and I think you kind of alluded to this, sought out the equalities between Aida and Amneris. They're both
Yeah, and you were
princesses.
alluding to that, and that's what Keith said as well. More than previous operas, even though Keith is absolutely right, Aida is the more appealing, sympathetic character, we are made to witness and empathize with Amneris' struggles as a human being, as a woman in love, as a woman who is daughter of a king. And so there is a great deal of equality in the sense that we see these people as real human beings. We see Aida's father, Amonasero, using her and threatening her with the ghost of her mother, that sort of thing. He's not some poor king who has been, defeated, and we feel sorry for him. We do feel sorry for him, but then he uses his own daughter and gets her involved in a lie and a deception and talks her into making her lover betray his own country. And so we see every aspect of the father-daughter relationship, the lover relationship, the national loyalties explored in very thoughtful and very moving ways.
And perhaps with a sense of the tragedy that those people had been through, all the death around them and all that kind of thing, and I think it comes through. But we have that, I guess it's a cinematic trope that we do have the gun on the wall with the trigger that has to be fired before the film is over, and I mean the piano.
Exactly.
So I know you've prepared some stuff. I don't know what you might want to bring out. I'm always interested in the interplay of the themes in a piece like this, particularly when he certainly had Wagner on his mind, and there are certain concepts attached to melodies in the way that maybe Wagner used the leitmotif. Am I being fair, or?
That's absolutely right. That is one thing I did want to talk about. Aida, more than any previous Verdi opera, uses themes and motives in what we would call a Wagnerian way. Verdi early on had used themes. There's the theme in Traviata. But what he is learning at this point, and it's interesting that right when he had decided to compose this opera, he wrote a friend of his and said, "You didn't bring me the book I asked you for." And the book was Wagner's essays on theater and on opera, and he really wanted to reread that. And it's a book in which Wagner discusses the idea of leitmotif, the idea of taking a theme and associating it with a particular character, and then as the plot thickens, transforming that theme. That's a very Wagnerian concept, but Aida comes closest in Verdi's work to doing that, and then of course makes possible his last two great operas, which are very Wagnerian in many ways, Otello and Falstaff. So I just want to remind us of a couple of these beautiful themes, if I may. Just cut me off when I speak or play too much. And thank you all for providing this lovely instrument. We'll see how it behaves. There is no overture in Aida, which is an amazing thing. He actually considered writing one for La Scala, and he hated it so much. This is a very unusual way to begin a Verdi opera, although it does bring back, those of you who just saw Traviata, you know, that shimmering opening to Traviata. Again, no overture. Which is so beautiful. Verdi does the same thing again in Aida, but listen to how chromatic. For those of you who don't know what the word chromatic is, the idea that you're jumping to different keys, that you're using half steps instead of the diatonic notes of the major or minor scale. Listen to how slippery this music is, and we realize later that this is the music of Aida and of her love for Radames. Listen to this prelude, which is most unusual, most un-Verdian in many ways. And if you listen to the orchestration, which obviously you won't have the benefit of now, I find that there's a lot of Wagnerian orchestration as well in this opera. See, it's a melody that doesn't have much definable shape. You see that it's clearly yearning towards something, but it's very ambiguous, and because of that, Verdi is able to use it at various points in the opera with different harmonies underneath it to symbolize different things. Then, of course, there are the Triumphal March and the motives of Egypt. Which seem to be very martial. Very often the words accompanying them are very bloodthirsty. But Verdi also takes that motive and takes the motives of the Egyptians, particularly of the bloodthirsty Egyptian priests, and turns those into softer and more beautiful music as they become a backdrop for Radames, the Egyptian, who is so proud of his heritage as an Egyptian and proud of himself as a captain in the army, and yet is conflicted. And so constantly the motives that have to do with love are being transformed to show hatred, to show anger, to show great emotional stress. The motives that are associated with war and violence are in the same way transformed and changed to show great emotional stress, to show love. It's a piece that, even though when you start out hearing great cries of war, always ends up with tenderness, with simplicity, with lyricism. Just when you think a rousing finale is ending with everybody saying, off with their heads, kill them all, he brings in another soft theme where he's transforming a motive for it to mean, I'm in love, I'm broken, I don't know what to do, I don't see a solution. And at the very end of the opera, of course, he tends to combine those themes in that beautiful, and this is completely unprecedented in Verdi's music, where he combines the chromaticism of the first theme that I played for you with the music of the Triumphal March. And it's unprecedented in the sense that they just sing it over and over again. This incredibly beautiful melody as Radames and Aida are dying together. She has chosen to come to where he is being buried alive, crushed alive, and die with him. And they sing music that is so ethereal, and there's no in it at all. It is about the love that they have for each other and how they'll be together forever. And listen to this beautiful melody that combines the Triumphal March and the chromatic prelude. Doesn't really seem to go anywhere, but they just keep singing it over and over again. She sings it, then he sings it, then they sing it together. And Verdi chooses very deliberately, and this happens a few times in Aida, he chooses very deliberately not to develop it in a Western way. He was very interested in finding out from musicologists what Egyptian music meant, and we might laugh at some of the things that he came up with today, but you know, he said, I've got to use a lot of reed instruments, a lot of wind instruments, and you'll hear in different places like that where he's trying to make things sound somehow Middle Eastern. And we even have a wonderful letter where he says, okay, I'll use all these weird wind instruments, I'll use a lot of oboe, I'll use bass clarinet because I know that sounds more Middle Eastern, but please don't make me have to use one of those wretched, and he uses some profanity, instruments of Mr. Sax. That's where he drew the line. He did not want to use a saxophone. But he was finding harmonically and with orchestral color to be very faithful. And what he does is very often to make the music sound more Eastern is that he purposely chooses not to develop a moment, but simply to repeat it in almost what we would call today a minimalist fashion. And it's a very interesting choice for a man who was so schooled in the school of developing themes.
Well, I think we're about to a time to start wrapping up and taking some questions. I do want to note a couple of people who are no longer with us. I think their presence will be felt. I know Peter J. Hall was involved in, I guess, costumes in this design as well.
That's right. We will be presenting his beautiful costumes as part of this production.
And I also have to think that Mr. Winspear, obviously, he's Otello at the opening of the hall was for him, and I have to think he'd be absolutely delighted to know Aida was happening.
Yes, I hope he would be.
Yes. All right. I think we can pass the mic around for questions. If anybody has anything about the opera for Stephen or Keith. Oh, we got the special question.
How were performances received in Egypt today?
How were performances received in Egypt today?
Oh, of Aida performances. I know I saw a big one was at the Luxor Pyramid at one point. It would seem it's still got a life there.
It's interesting, of course, to think. I was just talking to Rocky, who said she spent a few years in Egypt right after the first Gulf War. It's interesting to think of what Egyptians are going through right now.
Yeah.
And the fact is, I've spoken to several young Egyptians who associate productions of Aida with the regime of Mubarak, the idea that he was pandering to the West, and it's really too bad in many ways. But you have to think about that side of it too, that Egyptians who resented a military rule which was very oppressive to them, associated that military regime with productions of Aida. Now they're going through an incredible situation, whereas they're having to choose because of their runoff. Instead of choosing among candidates who got more than 50% of the vote, who are more moderate, they're having to choose between the last prime minister, Mubarak, who represents that old regime, and a candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, who, even though he's more moderate than other Islamists, is considered extreme by many Egyptians. And they're having to make that stark choice when Egypt, this country that has such a great cultural and intellectual history, is so full of moderates. And it's just interesting to see how Western music in general and the history of their own land are intertwined. I said that because I don't really know the answer to your question.
As you were speaking about Wagner's influence on Verdi, I couldn't help thinking about the fact that Verdi was always so generous in what he said and wrote about Wagner, and the influence was certainly there, and it was not at all reciprocated. And I've never understood quite what the source of Wagner's hatred of all things Verdian, where that came from. I mean, he actually referred to Verdi as a pig, and he must have been the only person who ever referred to that gentleman as a pig.
Well, I'm not sure about the last part, Suzanne, because I think there were others there, but you're absolutely right. Verdi was terribly hurt by the way he was addressed. You have to go back to the 1860s and realize this passion for what is new. Verdi, if you think about it, ended up doing exactly what Wagner did. In his own more conservative way, he revolutionized music theater, but he did it at his own pace. And Wagner, of course, the megalomaniac, egotist, it had to be all about him. And he really forced his disciples into this radical view that if they loved Wagner, they couldn't love anybody else's music. And it's really so interesting because what's happening with Aida is Verdi is trying, he's responding to those criticisms and trying in his own way to find a music that he feels is less artificial. He was criticized for using the old conventions of Italian opera in a way that was artificial. So now comes the aria, now we'll have the chorus, now we'll have the duet. And he was trying, and he wanted, and we know that even back in the early 1850s with Trovatore, he was trying to break out of that mold, but didn't know how. What Verdi didn't do, very intelligently, is try to write his own libretti. And that's what Wagner did. And Wagner to break the mold completely by writing his own libretti. So we know Lanzoni, the man who took Auguste Mariette's treatment scenario and turned it into poetry, was more conservative. And everything had to be poetry. Everything had to, and we see these wonders from Verdi to Ghisi Lanzoni when he's creating Aida. Send me 5-syllable lines. Send me lines that don't rhyme. Don't have all these common 8 and 10 syllable rhymes that are common to Italian poetry. Verdi even says at one point, in the theater, a great poet and a great composer must have the courage and the talent not to write poetry and not to write music. So Verdi is going for something more organic, very much something that Wagner pointed the way to. What I find interesting as a sidelight in all of this is that one of the Italian thinkers who most excoriated Verdi and who said cruel things like that about Verdi was this young hotshot poet and dramatist named Arrigo Boito. And what's very interesting is that Boito wasn't around at the time and certainly would never have considered writing a libretto for Aida, and so he had to turn to a more conservative poet. And Verdi, if you look at these letters, it's fantastic. At various times he says, what you wrote is beautiful, but it doesn't work dramatically. I'm going to write my own words. So Verdi came closer in Aida to contributing his own words to the libretto than he ever had before or would since. What happens then, of course, in the great story is that when Verdi decides he wants to redo Simon Boccanegra and write it according to more modern principles, they convince Boito, this young firebrand who had said nasty things about Verdi, to do that. And because of that, then we get these two great pieces in which finally Verdi's great genius is coupled with a worthy librettist, and it is the young Wagnerian Boito who writes the libretto both for Otello and for Falstaff. So in many ways, Aida is a step in that direction, but he didn't have the right librettist for it, and he didn't have even the courage of his own convictions. So it's interesting, if you read about Aida, some people will say, oh, it's so incredibly conventional, and other people will say, oh, it's incredibly groundbreaking, and both are true. It's groundbreaking for Verdi, but doesn't go nearly as far as Wagner does. But now when we look back at it, some of those quarrels that you're talking about seem so silly, because we recognize in both of these men some of the greatest achievements of the 19th century.
I guess we can imagine if Wagner had written Aida, you know, what it would be like. These strange archetype characters, kind of. I don't know.
I guess it would be
thought experiment.
I guess it would be Die Walküre. Yeah.
It would certainly be much longer.
Exactly. You know.
Bravo. Touche.
With Viking elements. Think on this long-term selection process for the principals, for the criteria. They have to have performed the role 10 times.
So the question is, for this long-term casting process, what are the criteria, and is it that they have to perform it 10 times before? We look to artists at not where they are today, but where they will be in the future. And if you look at the really big houses like the Met, which are now booking 6 or even 7 years ahead, not only do they need to make the casting decisions that all opera companies have to do, but they have to try to anticipate the arc of a singer's career and pick something that's going to be suitable for them down the road. So when we're looking 4 or 5 years out, we're looking at how we expect their voice to evolve, what kind of roles we think they'll be effective in dramatically, and what will be a good fit for them at that point in time. In some cases, that means bringing an artist who may have done the role many times. When we did Rigoletto and had to replace the title role at short notice, I was very keen to bring Gabinelli here, who still sings very well and acts splendidly, but that's obviously a role he's done well over 200 times and something he's very familiar with. Or we will look, in other cases, for singers who have, in fact, never done a role before, but we think that it will be a good fit for where we expect them to be. And that's part of why this is such a difficult process, is trying to make those guesses.
If I can jump in, it is incredibly difficult, and we all know, of course, in Dallas, how fortunate we are to have Jonathan Pell, who has amazing ears, and to have Keith making these decisions. But if you look at the quality, the track record of Dallas Opera, in many ways making these informed guesses, it's not gambling exactly, but you have to have the assurance that this kid will grow into this. If you take someone who's done the role 50 times already, 5 years from now they might not be able to do it. It's really difficult, and it is, if I can say, there's a sociological landscape that figures into all this, which is it's harder than ever to have a career as an opera singer. Opera companies are, unfortunately, in the position of luxury in the sense that they can get people to commit to 6 years in advance without maybe as high a fee as would have been common 20 years ago. And the fact is, there's a smaller pool in the sense that there are many young opera singers who would love to have that break, but fewer who are actually getting a chance. And that is just a fact of the way things are.
And also the bar of what we expect from singers goes up every year. It's almost unimaginable now to make a casting decision for a major role without thinking about how effective they're going to be theatrically. And some opera singers are extraordinarily gifted actors and actresses, and some are only perhaps moderately gifted on that side, but of course have extraordinary vocal capabilities. But there's such emphasis now on people not only sounding great, having real theatrical presence. There's much more focus than there ever used to be on physical appearance. It's a huge plus for singers if they happen to be handsome or beautiful as appropriate. And that's something that also audiences are looking for. We have performed simulcast here at the Dallas Opera. We've done now 3 since I've been here. This is something that's being done all over the country. Philadelphia is now doing their first. Seattle just did their first. Many other companies have already done them. Those kinds of events also, if you have someone who can sing very well and act very well and looks great in the part, you're always going to be looking for something like that. And then I think no matter how skilled the actor, there is also just this component of believability. And I'll finish with just a quick story from San Francisco. We were performing Mozart's Concert van Tutte, and Frederica von Stade was making her role debut as Despina, and Flicka has been here a number of times. She is absolutely beloved in the opera world, and for good reason. And I was at a little cast party with her, and she had just turned 60, and she looked at me and said, well, you know, I'm getting a little old to play the ingenue now, Keith. So I thought, but till her late 50s, she was playing one of the sisters with great charm and great effect, and that's so. I think of Flicka, she could probably be 95 and still pull it off. But she had made that transition, and by the way, she was such a tremendous Despina that she ran with the production because she was so funny. So these are all things that we need to think about.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. A couple of last things about WRR. If you're not already aware, WRR is playing operas every Saturday during the non-Met season. I think it starts back up on December 8th, but we've got about 30 of them to play in the coming months. So do tune in on Saturdays at noon for an opera every Saturday. This week it's Il Turco in Italia with Cecilia Bartoli, and then for Father's Day weekend, one of the greatest dads in all opera, Simon Boccanegra, is going to be the opera for that day. So we hope you can catch those. And also, I guess excerpts from this conversation will be on this Saturday after Il Turco around 2:40, 2:45, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you.